Major Sarah Chen dragged her olive green duffel bag through the bustling corridors of Denver International Airport, her entire body aching with a bone-deep exhaustion that only came from months of combat operations. At 38 years old, she'd been flying F-18 Super Hornets for the United States Marine Corps for over 12 years, but this last deployment had pushed her to her absolute limits. 6 months in the Middle East, 87 combat missions, 3 near-death experiences, and enough adrenaline-fueled nights to last a lifetime. Today was supposed to be simple. Get on the plane, fly home to San Diego, hug her wife Jessica and their 8-year-old daughter Emma, sleep for approximately 72 hours straight, maybe remember what it felt like to be a normal person instead of a weapon system operator trained to deliver precision death from 30,000 feet. Sarah glanced at her watch, 2:15 p.m. Her flight, United Airlines 447 to San Diego, was boarding in 20 minutes at gate B47. She moved through the terminal like a ghost, her worn Yankees baseball cap pulled low over her short black hair, aviator sunglasses hiding the dark circles under her eyes. She deliberately dressed down, faded jeans, a plain gray hoodie and beat-up Nikes, specifically to avoid attention. The last thing she wanted was someone recognizing her military bearing and starting a conversation about serving our country or thanking her for her service. Not today. Today, she just wanted to be invisible. As she walked past a sports bar, CNN played on multiple screens overhead, breaking news about tensions in the South China Sea. Another defense budget debate in Congress. Sarah felt her jaw tighten involuntarily. Even on leave, she couldn't escape it. The weight of global conflicts, political posturing, and the very real possibility that her next deployment could be her last, it all pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Her phone buzzed. A text from Jessica. "Emma made you a welcome home banner. It's covering half the living room. We miss you so much. Fly safe, my love." Sarah smiled for the first time in days, a genuine warmth spreading through her chest. That's what she was fighting for. Not abstract concepts of freedom or democracy, though those mattered, but for Emma's right to grow up in a world where she could make ridiculous banners and not worry about bombs falling from the sky. For Jessica's ability to teach fourth graders without fear. For the ordinary, beautiful, boring normalcy that Sarah protected from 40,000 feet above hostile territory. At Gate B47, the boarding area was packed with the usual mix of business travelers, families, and college students. Sarah found a corner seat away from the crowd and pulled out her tattered paperback, a thriller novel she'd been trying to finish for 3 months. She'd read the same page 17 times, her mind too wired from combat operations to focus on fictional danger when she'd been living the real thing. Now boarding Group 1 and all passengers requiring special assistance, the gate agent announced in that practiced monotone unique to airline employees everywhere. Sarah remained seated. She was Group 3, Seat 8A, a window seat she'd specifically selected because it meant only one person could bother her instead of 2. As the boarding groups were called, she watched the diverse cross-section of America shuffle down the jetway. An elderly couple holding hands, probably married for 50 years. A young mother wrestling with a toddler and too many bags. A businessman already barking into his phone about quarterly reports. College kids with oversized backpacks, heading home or to adventure. Regular people, living regular lives, completely unaware that the exhausted woman in the corner had spent the last 6 months making split-second decisions that meant the difference between successful missions and international incidents. Group 3, you may now board. Sarah stood, slinging her duffel over her shoulder with practiced ease. The bag contained everything she'd taken overseas: uniforms, flight suits, personal items, and, tucked in a carefully sealed pocket, the letters she'd written to Jessica and Emma in case she didn't make it home. She hadn't told them about those letters. She never would if she could help it. The jetway smelled like recycled air and jet fuel, a scent so familiar it was almost comforting. Sarah showed her boarding pass to the flight attendant at the aircraft door, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a professional smile. "Welcome aboard, Miss Chen. 8A is on your left, about 4 rows back." "Thank you," Sarah replied quietly, moving down the narrow aisle. Seat 8A was perfect, just behind the wing where she could see the engine and watch for any mechanical anomalies. Old habits died hard. Even on commercial flights, Sarah couldn't help but assess the aircraft's condition, listen to the engine sounds, feel for vibrations that shouldn't be there. Her instructors at flight school had drilled it into her. A good pilot is always flying, even when they're a passenger. She wedged her duffel into the overhead compartment and settled into her seat, immediately pulling out her seatbelt and clicking it into place. The familiar ritual was oddly soothing. Through the small oval window, she could see ground crew loading baggage, refueling trucks disconnecting hoses, and the controlled chaos of airport operations. A businessman took the middle seat, 8B, barely acknowledging her as he immediately opened his laptop. Perfect. No conversation required. As more passengers filed past, Sarah closed her eyes and let her head rest against the cool window. Just a few more hours, she told herself. A few more hours and she'd be home. Safe. On the ground. Where the most dangerous thing she'd have to navigate was Emma's demands for bedtime stories and Jessica's honeydew list that had apparently grown to epic proportions during her absence. The flight attendants moved through their safety demonstration. Sarah had heard it thousands of times. The nearest exit might be behind you, oxygen masks drop from above, seat cushions can be used as flotation devices. She knew every word by heart. At 2:47 p.m., United Flight 447 pushed back from the gate, carrying 156 passengers and 6 crew members. Major Sarah Chen, exhausted warrior and decorated combat pilot, had no idea that in exactly 47 minutes, she would be the only thing standing between all those people and certain death. She had no idea that Seat 8A was about to become the most important seat on the plane. She had no idea that her war wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The explosion came without warning. One moment, Sarah was half asleep, her mind drifting through fragmented dreams of home. The next, a sound like a massive sledgehammer striking a steel drum reverberated through the entire aircraft. It was a sound Sarah knew intimately, the sound of catastrophic mechanical failure, of metal tearing itself apart under impossible stress. Her eyes snapped open, adrenaline flooding her system like an injection of pure electricity. Years of combat training overrode everything else. Her body went rigid, every sense immediately on high alert, scanning for threats, assessing the situation, preparing for action. The Boeing 737 lurched violently to the left, throwing passengers against their seatbelts. Screams erupted throughout the cabin, raw, primal sounds of terror. Sarah's hands shot out, bracing against the seat in front of her and the window beside her, her core muscles automatically engaging to stabilize her body against the sudden movement. Then came the sounds that made her blood run cold. A series of rapid-fire bangs like popcorn in a microwave, but infinitely more sinister, metal grinding against metal, a high-pitched whining that rose in pitch until it became almost unbearable. And underneath it all, a deep, rhythmic thumping that she felt more than heard, the unmistakable vibration of an engine tearing itself apart. Sarah's head whipped toward the window. What she saw made her stomach drop into free fall. The left engine, the massive GE turbofan that should have been spinning in a perfect blur, was disintegrating before her eyes. Chunks of metal cowling were peeling away like aluminum foil, tumbling into the slipstream. The engine's internal components were visible through gaps in the housing, and they were glowing red-hot. Flames licked out from the turbine section, bright orange against the clear blue Colorado sky. But that wasn't the worst part. As Sarah watched in horror, a massive piece of turbine blade, at least 3 feet long, separated from the engine assembly and shot backward like a missile. It missed the fuselage by what couldn't have been more than 5 feet, spinning end over end as it disappeared into the distance. "Oh God," the businessman in 8B whispered, his laptop forgotten, his face pressed against Sarah's shoulder as he strained to see out the window. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." The cabin pressure suddenly dropped. Sarah's ears popped painfully, and a split second later, oxygen masks deployed from the overhead compartments with a mechanical snap that sent dozens of passengers into fresh waves of panic. "Put on your masks." A flight attendant screamed from the front of the cabin, her professional demeanor cracking under the strain. "Put on your masks now." Sarah grabbed her mask with one hand, pulling it over her face with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it hundreds of times in training. With her other hand, she continued watching the engine, her pilot's brain automatically analyzing what she was seeing. Total engine failure, catastrophic disintegration, possible FOD damage to other systems, foreign object debris from the exploded engine could have struck the fuselage, the wing, or even the other engine. They were losing altitude. She could feel it in her gut, that sickening sensation of an aircraft no longer maintaining its flight path. Around her, the cabin had descended into chaos. A woman 3 rows back was sobbing uncontrollably, clutching her young son who stared wide-eyed at his dangling oxygen mask like it was an alien creature. 2 businessmen across the aisle were shouting at each other, their argument about who knows what instantly forgotten as they fumbled with their masks. A teenage girl was recording everything on her phone, her hands shaking so badly the video had to be unwatchable. The plane lurched again, this time more severely. The nose pitched down at least 10 degrees, maybe 15. Carry-on bags that hadn't been properly secured flew out of overhead compartments, striking passengers. Someone's laptop sailed past Sarah's head, missing her by inches before crashing into the seat back in front of her. The aircraft's frame groaned, a low, ominous sound that resonated through every rivet and weld. Sarah had heard that sound before, during emergency training scenarios that pushed aircraft to their structural limits. It was the sound of an airplane being stressed beyond its design parameters, the sound of tons of aluminum and composite materials being asked to do things they were never meant to do. Through her window, Sarah saw the wing flexing in ways that should have been impossible. The massive structure bent upward, then down, then up again, oscillating like a guitar string. That meant they'd lost hydraulic pressure. The systems that controlled the plane's flight surfaces were failing. This was bad. This was very, very bad. Then came the announcement that changed everything. The intercom crackled to life, and Captain Michael Rodriguez's voice filled the cabin. But it wasn't the calm, reassuring pilot's voice that passengers expected. It was tight, strained, barely controlled, the voice of a man staring into the abyss and trying not to blink. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez." A pause, a shaky breath. "We have experienced a catastrophic failure of our left engine and have lost multiple hydraulic systems. We are declaring an emergency and will be attempting to land as soon as possible." Another pause, longer this time. Sarah could hear muffled voices in the background of the cockpit, urgent and overlapping. "If there are any pilots on board this aircraft, we need you to identify yourselves to the flight attendants immediately. I repeat, if there are any pilots on board, we need you in the cockpit now." The cabin fell into a shocked silence. Sarah felt every pair of eyes turn, scanning the passengers, looking for salvation. The businessman in 8B had gone pale, his lips moving in what might have been prayer. The teenage girl with the phone had stopped recording. Even the crying woman had gone quiet, clutching her son tighter. Sarah's hand was already on her seatbelt buckle. Her heart hammered in her chest, not from fear, but from the familiar sensation of combat readiness. This was what she'd been trained for. Not this exact scenario, not in a commercial aircraft, but the fundamental challenge was the same. Systems failing, people dying if she didn't act, split-second decisions that meant the difference between catastrophe and survival. The flight attendant, the same woman who'd welcomed Sarah aboard, appeared in the aisle, her eyes desperately scanning the passengers. "Is anyone here a pilot? Anyone at all?" Sarah's hand shot up. The flight attendant's gaze locked onto her, and for a moment, Sarah saw the flicker of doubt cross her face. Sarah knew what she saw: a young woman in a baseball cap and hoodie, exhausted circles under her eyes, looking more like a college student than anyone's idea of salvation. But Sarah was already unbuckling, already standing, already reaching into her back pocket for her military ID. "Major Sarah Chen, United States Marine Corps," she said, her voice cutting through the cabin noise with the authority of someone who'd commanded flight operations in combat zones. "F-18 Super Hornet pilot, 2,000 combat hours, current deployment status." She thrust her military ID toward the flight attendant. "What's the situation in the cockpit?" The flight attendant's hands trembled as she examined the ID. When she looked up, her eyes were glistening with tears, tears of hope, maybe, or just the relief of finding someone, anyone, who might know what to do. "The captain's injured, his arm is broken. The first officer," her voice cracked. "The first officer is unconscious. Something came through the windshield. They're trying to fly, but they can barely." "Take me to them," Sarah interrupted, already moving forward. "Now." As she pushed past rows of terrified passengers, Sarah felt the weight of 156 lives settle onto her shoulders. She'd felt this weight before, leading missions over hostile territory. But those missions had been in her aircraft, with her training, with systems she understood intimately. This was different. This was a commercial Boeing 737, an aircraft she'd never flown, with systems she'd only read about, in a situation that was already spiraling beyond anyone's control. Behind her, passengers whispered prayers. Ahead of her, through the cockpit door, came the sound of warning alarms and desperate voices. Major Sarah Chen took a deep breath and stepped forward into the unknown. Sarah's hand gripped the cockpit door handle, and for a brief moment, just a fraction of a second, she hesitated. Behind this door was responsibility on a scale she'd never experienced. In combat, she'd been responsible for her aircraft, her mission, her wingmen. But this was 156 civilians who'd boarded a plane expecting nothing more dramatic than stale pretzels and a boring safety video. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Jennifer Martinez, stood beside her, one hand braced against the wall as the aircraft continued its sickening oscillation. "They don't know you're coming," Jennifer said quickly, her words tumbling out in a rush. "The captain, Captain Rodriguez, he can barely hold the controls. I don't think he can last much longer." Sarah nodded once sharply, then she yanked the door open. The cockpit was worse than anything she'd imagined. Captain Michael Rodriguez sat hunched in the left seat, his face a mask of agony and concentration. His right arm hung at his side at a grotesque angle, clearly broken between the elbow and wrist. Sarah could see bone fragment pressing against the skin, creating a sickening bulge in his uniform sleeve. Despite this, he gripped the yoke with his left hand, his knuckles white with strain, fighting to keep the aircraft level. But it was the first officer who made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. First Officer David Kim slumped in the right seat, unconscious or worse. Blood covered the right side of his face, streaming from a deep gash that ran from his temple to his jaw. More blood matted his dark hair and stained his white uniform shirt. His head lolled at an angle that suggested he might have a neck injury. The right side of the windshield, directly in front of his position, had a spiderweb pattern of cracks radiating out from a central impact point, and Sarah could see what looked like pieces of engine cowling embedded in the thick glass. "Jesus Christ," Sarah breathed. The cockpit itself was a nightmare of flashing warning lights and blaring alarms. Every panel seemed to be screaming for attention. Master caution lights blazed red. The hydraulic pressure gauges showed critical lows on 2 of 3 systems. Engine instruments for the left engine showed nothing but zeros, a dead engine, completely offline. The right engine's readings were in the yellow, approaching red, overheating as it struggled to compensate for the lost thrust. "Who the hell are you?" Rodriguez gasped, his voice ragged with pain. Sweat poured down his face despite the cold air rushing through gaps in the damaged windshield. "Major Sarah Chen, United States Marine Corps, sir," Sarah said, already squeezing past Jennifer into the cramped cockpit space. "F-18 pilot, I'm here to help." Rodriguez's eyes, glazed with shock and pain, focused on her with something that looked like desperate hope. "You know how to fly a 737? "No," Sarah admitted, her eyes already scanning the instrument panel, her pilot's brain beginning to process the avalanche of information. "But I know how to fly. Talk me through what's happening." "Left engine exploded 13 minutes ago," Rodriguez gritted out, every word clearly costing him. "Took out hydraulics A and B. We're flying on System C only, but it's degrading. Lost primary flight controls. We're on alternate mode, mechanical cables only. Response is sluggish as hell." Sarah moved to the first officer's position, gently checking David Kim's pulse. It was there, weak but steady. "Jennifer, I need you to carefully move him to the jump seat. Be careful of his neck and head." As Jennifer worked to secure the unconscious first officer with help from another flight attendant who'd appeared at the door, Sarah slid into the right seat. The yoke in front of her trembled with the aircraft's instability. Through the cracked windshield, she could see they were in a gradual descent, the ground slowly rising to meet them. "Altitude?" Sarah asked, her hands hovering over the controls, not touching anything yet. 22,000 feet, Rodriguez replied. "Losing about 800 feet per minute. I can't stop it. The nose wants to drop and I don't have the strength to hold it up with one arm." Sarah's eyes flicked across the altimeter, airspeed indicator, vertical speed indicator, the fundamental instruments that told her where they were and where they were going. They were at 22,400 feet now. No, 22,300. The ground was coming up fast. "Where are we?" she asked. "About 60 miles west of Pueblo, Colorado," Rodriguez said. "I was trying to get us back to Denver, but—" He trailed off, the impossibility of that goal evident in his voice. Sarah pulled up the navigation display, her fingers moving across the touchscreen with surprising confidence. She might not know this aircraft, but modern glass cockpits all followed similar logic. "Pueblo Memorial Airport," she said, finding it on the map. "Runway 8L26R, 8,400 feet. It's our best shot." "That runway's too short," Rodriguez protested. "We need at least 10,000 feet in this condition." "We don't have 10,000 feet available," Sarah cut him off, her voice calm but firm. "Look at our rate of descent. Look at the engine temperatures. We've got maybe 15 minutes before that right engine quits, and then we're a glider. A really bad glider carrying 30 tons of fuel and people. Pueblo, is it?" Rodriguez stared at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "You really think you can land this thing?" Sarah's hands closed around the yoke, feeling the aircraft's wounded response through the controls. It was nothing like her F-18, nothing like the responsive, powerful fighter jet she knew intimately. This was a lumbering giant, crippled and dying, fighting her every input. "I've landed on aircraft carriers in the middle of the ocean during tropical storms," Sarah said quietly. "I've brought jets home with half their systems offline and enemy fighters on my tail. I've done emergency landings where I had 30 seconds to make it work or die." She turned to look directly at Rodriguez, and he saw something in her eyes that made him believe. A kind of cold, focused intensity that only came from someone who'd stared death in the face and refused to blink. "But I'm not going to lie to you, Captain. I've never flown a 737. I've never landed a commercial aircraft. I've never been responsible for this many lives at once." She paused, her jaw tightening. But I'm what you've got, and I'm going to get every single person on this plane on the ground alive. You have my word." Rodriguez nodded slowly, something like relief washing over his pain-racked features. "What do you need from me?" "Talk me through the landing procedures. Systems, speeds, configurations, everything. And handle communications. Get Pueblo on the radio and tell them we're coming in hot." "Done," Rodriguez said, already reaching for the radio with his good hand. Sarah took a deep breath and gently, carefully, began to take control of the aircraft. The yoke responded sluggishly to her inputs, like she was trying to steer a ship through molasses. The plane wanted to drop its nose, wanted to roll left where the dead engine created asymmetric thrust. Every instinct from her fighter jet experience screamed at her that the controls were wrong, too slow, too heavy. She pushed those instincts down and focused on what was real. The instruments, the horizon, the feel of the aircraft through her hands. Behind her, she could hear Jennifer updating the cabin crew, could hear the muffled sounds of passengers preparing for an emergency landing. In front of her, through the damaged windshield, the Colorado landscape spread out in afternoon sunshine, beautiful, peaceful, completely indifferent to the drama unfolding at 21,000 feet. Sarah's hands tightened on the yoke. "Pueblo Tower, this is United 447, Rodriguez said into his headset, his voice steady despite his pain. "We are declaring an emergency, requesting immediate clearance for landing. We have catastrophic engine failure, injured crew, and limited flight controls." Static crackled. Then, "United 447, Pueblo Tower, we copy your emergency. Runway 26R is being cleared. Emergency vehicles are rolling. What is your souls on board and fuel remaining?" 162 souls, Rodriguez replied. "Fuel is," he glanced at the gauge, "approximately 8,000 pounds. Sarah did the math instantly. 8,000 pounds of fuel. That was roughly 1,200 gallons. In an aircraft moving at 300 knots. If they crashed, if they couldn't stop, if anything went wrong, they'd be a 30-ton bomb filled with terrified people. "Major Chen," Rodriguez said quietly, "you've got the aircraft, get us home." Sarah's eyes fixed on the horizon, her entire world narrowing to the task ahead. "Copy that, Captain," she said. "Let's bring them home." Sarah's hands moved across the Boeing 737's control panel with methodical precision, her eyes darting between instruments as she absorbed information faster than her conscious mind could process. This was the state she'd learned to enter during combat missions, a place where training, instinct, and calculation merged into something almost transcendent. Fighter pilots called it being in the zone. Sarah called it survival mode. "Talk me through the approach speeds," she said to Rodriguez, her voice eerily calm considering they were plummeting toward Earth in a crippled aircraft. Rodriguez shifted in his seat, grimacing as the movement sent fresh waves of agony through his shattered arm. "Flaps up, we're looking at 180 knots for final approach. Flaps 5, about 150. Full flaps, 130 knots for landing." He coughed, the sound wet and painful. "But with hydraulics failing, I don't know if we can deploy flaps at all." Sarah's jaw tightened. Flaps were crucial. They changed the wing's shape to generate more lift at slower speeds, allowing for a controlled, gentle landing. Without them, they'd have to come in much faster, which meant needing much more runway to stop. Runway they didn't have. "What's our current weight?" she asked. Rodriguez checked the display. 132,000 pounds. "We're heavy. We burned minimal fuel since takeoff." Sarah's mind raced through the calculations. A 737 at that weight, coming in without flaps, would need to touch down at roughly 165 knots, about 190 miles per hour. At that speed, even with perfect brakes, they'd need every inch of Pueblo's 8,400-foot runway and then some. And they wouldn't have perfect brakes. They wouldn't have perfect anything. "Altitude 20,000 feet, she announced, her eyes on the altimeter, descending through. Through the shattered windshield, she could see the landscape below with startling clarity. The Rocky Mountains loomed to the west, their snow-capped peaks gleaming in the afternoon sun. To the east, the Great Plains stretched endlessly, a patchwork of browns and greens. And somewhere ahead, invisible but approaching fast, was Pueblo Memorial Airport, a small regional facility that was about to receive the emergency landing of the century. United 447 Pueblo Tower, the radio crackled. We have equipment standing by. Fire and rescue are positioned. Hospital has been notified. Runway 26R is clear and ready. Current winds are 270 at 12 knots, gusting to 18. Copy, Pueblo, Rodriguez responded. Be advised, we have limited flight control authority and may not be able to execute a standard approach. That was putting it mildly, Sarah thought. What they were about to attempt wasn't a non-standard approach. It was controlled chaos, a desperate gamble wrapped in aviation terminology to make it sound professional. She felt the aircraft shudder as they passed through some turbulence. The yoke bucked in her hands, and she had to fight to keep the wings level. With only one functioning hydraulic system, the aircraft's natural stability was compromised. Every gust of wind, every tiny adjustment, required constant vigilance and correction. Captain, Sarah said carefully, I need you to be completely honest with me. What's the worst-case scenario if we try to deploy flaps? Rodriguez was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was grim. Worst case. The flaps deploy asymmetrically, one side extends, the other doesn't. That would create a massive imbalance. The wing with deployed flaps would generate more lift and drag. We'd roll uncontrollably, and with our limited controls, we wouldn't be able to correct it. And if that happens at low altitude during approach, Sarah pressed. We'd cartwheel into the ground, Rodriguez said flatly. Everyone dies. Sarah nodded slowly. That's what she'd thought. And if we don't deploy flaps at all? We come in hot and fast, maybe too fast to stop. We run off the end of the runway at 100 miles an hour. The aircraft breaks apart. Some people survive the initial crash, but with 8,000 pounds of fuel. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Fire explosion, a fireball visible for miles. Sarah stared ahead at the horizon, her mind working through the impossible mathematics of survival. Behind her, she could hear Jennifer and the other flight attendants moving through the cabin, checking seatbelts, briefing passengers on brace positions, speaking in calm, professional voices that masked their own terror. Somewhere in that cabin was a family going on vacation, business people trying to get home, college students, elderly couples, children, 156 souls who'd trusted that when they boarded Flight 447, they'd arrive safely at their destination. And now their lives depended entirely on a Marine fighter pilot who'd never flown this type of aircraft, making a choice between two different flavors of catastrophe. Altitude 17,000 feet, Sarah announced. Pueblo should be visible soon. Rodriguez pointed with his good hand at the navigation display. There, 28 miles, 11 o'clock. Sarah looked up and saw it, a tiny strip of gray against the brown landscape, like a pencil mark on a canvas. So small, so impossibly, terrifyingly small. Her F-18 would land on an aircraft carrier deck that was only 500 feet long. But her F-18 weighed 30,000 pounds and could stop on a dime using arresting cables. This aluminum whale weighed 132,000 pounds and had nothing but conventional brakes that were probably already compromised by the hydraulic failures. Give me the numbers again, she said. Landing distance required with full flaps versus no flaps. Rodriguez pulled up the data on the flight management computer, squinting through his pane. Full flaps, perfect conditions, we'd need about 5,000 feet. No flaps, same conditions, closer to 8,000 feet. He paused. But we don't have perfect conditions. We have degraded brakes, potential tire damage from the engine debris, a damaged landing gear system, and wind gusts. Realistically, add 20% to those numbers. Sarah did the math. With flaps, 6,000 feet needed. They had 8,400, a margin of 2,400 feet theoretically safe. Without flaps, 9,600 feet needed. They had 8,400, a deficit of 1,200 feet. They'd run off the runway at lethal speed. But those calculations assumed the flaps worked properly. If they didn't, if they deployed asymmetrically, none of the math mattered because they'd be dead before they reached the runway. United 447, Pueblo Tower. You are cleared to land runway 26R, winds now 280 at 15 knots. The wind had shifted slightly, now more of a crosswind. That made everything harder. Sarah would have to crab the aircraft, fly at an angle to compensate for the wind pushing them sideways, then straighten out at the last moment before touchdown. A maneuver she'd done countless times in fighters, never in a crippled airliner. Altitude 15,000 feet, she said. Beginning descent profile for Pueblo. Sarah pushed the yoke forward slightly, feeling the nose drop. The descent rate increased to 1,200 feet per minute. The ground rose up to meet them with sickening speed. She made her decision. "Captain Rodriguez," she said, her voice steady, "here's what we're going to do. We're going to attempt a flaps 5 landing, partial flaps only, not full deployment." Rodriguez's eyes widened. "Partial, that's not a standard configuration." "I know," Sarah interrupted, "but it's our best compromise. Flaps 5 will give us some lift benefit and let us slow down, but it's a smaller deployment. Less risk of asymmetry, less chance of catastrophic failure. We'll come in at 155 knots instead of 130, but that's manageable." "You're splitting the difference," Rodriguez said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Between safety and catastrophe." "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "At altitude 14,000, we'll try to deploy flaps to position 5. If they deploy symmetrically, we continue the approach. If anything looks wrong, any vibration, any asymmetry, anything at all, I'll immediately retract them and we'll land clean. No flaps at all." "And if we can't stop without full flaps?" Rodriguez asked quietly. Sarah turned to look at him, and her eyes were hard as diamonds. "Then we'll run off the end of the runway. But we'll do it with the aircraft under control, with everyone strapped in and braced, with fire equipment already rolling. Some people will probably survive that. Nobody survives a cartwheel at 200 knots." Rodriguez held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "You're the pilot in command now, Major. Make the call." Sarah's hands gripped the yoke. Through the windshield, Pueblo Airport was growing larger, more distinct. She could see the runway now, could see the emergency vehicles lined up alongside it, tiny red and white dots at this distance. "Altitude 14,000 feet, she announced. "Here we go, deploying flaps to position 5. Her hand moved to the flap lever, hesitated for just a heartbeat, then pushed it forward to the first detent. Every soul on United Flight 447 held their breath as the fate of 162 people hung on the movement of metal panels on the wings of a dying aircraft. The flap lever clicked into position with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the tense cockpit. For 3 seconds, 3 eternal seconds, nothing happened. Sarah's eyes locked onto the flap position indicator on the instrument panel, her breath frozen in her lungs. Rodriguez leaned forward as much as his broken arm would allow, equally transfixed. Then slowly, agonizingly, the indicator began to move. "Flaps in transit," Rodriguez breathed. "Left side showing 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees." Sarah felt it through the yoke, a subtle change in the aircraft's handling, a slight increase in drag. The wings were changing shape, the leading edge slats extending, the trailing edge flaps beginning their deployment. Everything depended on whether both sides did this symmetrically. "Right side," Rodriguez continued, his voice tight. 2 degrees, 3, 4. A groan echoed through the airframe, metal moving on compromised hydraulics, mechanical systems pushed beyond their design limits. Sarah's grip on the yoke tightened, ready to yank the flap lever back to zero at the first sign of trouble. 4 degrees, 4.5, Rodriguez's voice cracked with tension. Come on, come on. The aircraft shuddered. Sarah felt it through her entire body, a vibration that could have been normal, or could have been the beginning of an asymmetric deployment that would kill them all. Talk to me, Captain, Sarah snapped. Left side 5 degrees, right side 4.8, 4.9, 5 degrees, Rodriguez exhaled explosively. We've got symmetric deployment, flaps 5 locked and equal. Sarah allowed herself one small breath of relief. Flap position verified, she confirmed, her eyes scanning every instrument. The airspeed was bleeding off as the increased drag took effect. The vertical speed had increased, they were descending faster now. But more importantly, the aircraft felt more stable, more controllable. Altitude 12,000 feet, she announced. Airspeed 210 knots, descending 1,400 feet per minute. Through the cracked windshield, Pueblo was no longer a distant pencil mark. It was real now, growing larger with every passing second. Sarah could make out individual buildings, roads, the dark ribbon of the Arkansas River cutting through the city. And the runway, that critical strip of concrete that represented their only chance at survival, stood out clearly, oriented almost east-west, waiting for them. United 447, Pueblo Tower. You are 10 miles from runway threshold. Descend and maintain 8,000 feet until established on final approach. Unable, Sarah responded immediately, keying the radio. We cannot maintain any altitude. We are in a continuous descent. Current altitude 11,000 feet, rate of descent 1,400 feet per minute. We will not level off. A pause on the radio. Sarah could imagine the controller's face, the sudden understanding that this wasn't a standard emergency. This was an aircraft barely under control, falling out of the sky. United 447, copy. You are cleared for immediate landing, any runway. Emergency equipment is standing by. Behind Sarah in the cabin, flight attendant Jennifer Martinez moved through the aisles with mechanical efficiency, her training overriding her fear. Heads down, stay down, she commanded. Bend over, heads between your knees, hands over your heads. The passengers obeyed, most of them. Some were crying. Others prayed. Sarah could hear fragments of whispered entreaties to every god humanity had ever imagined. A child somewhere in the back was wailing, the sound cutting through the drone of the remaining engine like a knife. Mommy, I don't want to die, the child's voice carried forward. I don't want to die. Sarah's jaw clenched. That child was not going to die. None of them were. She would not allow it. Altitude 10,000 feet, she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. Airspeed 195 knots. Then the right engine coughed. It was a subtle change at first, a slight decrease in the steady whine, a barely perceptible drop in thrust. But Sarah felt it instantly through the controls, and Rodriguez saw it on the instruments. Engine 2, Rodriguez said urgently. EGT rising. Exhaust gas temperature is 920 degrees, 940-960. Red line, Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. 950 degrees, Rodriguez confirmed. We're over red line and climbing. The engine's cooking itself. Sarah's mind raced. The left engine was dead. The right engine was dying. If it quit before they reached the runway, they'd be a 132,000-pound glider with the aerodynamic properties of a brick. They'd fall short, crash into the industrial area south of the airport, and vaporize in a fireball that would be seen from Denver. How long do we have? She asked. Rodriguez studied the gauges, his face grim. EGT at 980, 990. At this rate, maybe 5 minutes before automatic shutdown, maybe less before it fails catastrophically. Sarah looked ahead. The runway was 7 miles away. They were descending through 9,000 feet at nearly 1,500 feet per minute. She did the math instantly. They had roughly 6 minutes until touchdown, assuming everything went perfectly. Everything was not going perfectly. "We're not going to make it," Rodriguez said quietly. "Yes, we are," Sarah countered, her voice hard as steel. She pushed the yoke forward, increasing their descent rate. "If we're going to lose that engine, I want to be as low as possible when it happens. That'll put us below the glide slope." "I don't care about the glide slope," Sarah shot back. "Standard procedures don't apply anymore, Captain. We're flying this my way now." She pushed harder, feeling the nose drop, feeling the aircraft accelerate as gravity took over. The vertical speed indicator climbed, 1,600 feet per minute, 1800-2000. "Jesus Christ," Rodriguez whispered. The ground rushed up at them with terrifying speed. Sarah had done steep approaches before, combat landings in hostile zones where you came in fast and hard to minimize your time in enemy range. But those had been in fighters, small and nimble. This was a commercial airliner loaded with fuel and people, diving toward Earth like a missile with wings. "Altitude 8,000 feet, Sarah announced. "Airspeed 200 knots, descent rate 2,000 feet per minute." Through the windshield, she could see individual cars on the highways below, houses with pools in their backyards, a shopping mall parking lot filled with tiny vehicles. They were so low now that people on the ground would be able to look up and see the damaged aircraft, see the dead engine, see their doom approaching. The right engine coughed again, harder this time. The EGT gauge spiked to 1,010 degrees. "We're going to lose it," Rodriguez shouted. "Not yet," Sarah said through gritted teeth. "Not yet, not yet, not yet." She was talking to the engine now, willing it to survive, begging a machine to hold together for just a few more minutes, just long enough to get them over the runway threshold, just long enough to give them a chance. "Altitude 6,000 feet, she called out. 5 miles to runway." The Pueblo airport dominated her forward view now. She could see the fire trucks lined up, could see the foam trucks ready to spray, could see what had to be 100 emergency vehicles with lights flashing. The entire city's emergency response was waiting for them. "Gear down," Sarah ordered. "Are you sure?" Rodriguez asked. "Deploying gear will increase drag, slow us down." "That's the point," Sarah interrupted. "We need to slow down, and I need to know if the gear works before we try to land on it. Gear down, now." Rodriguez reached for the landing gear lever with his good hand and pulled. A grinding, screeching sound reverberated through the airframe, the sound of machinery operating on minimal hydraulics, fighting against aerodynamic forces, trying to lower 3 sets of wheels that were the only thing standing between them and a belly landing. "Left main gear," Rodriguez narrated, watching the indicator lights. "Green light, left main is down and locked." A clunk shuddered through the plane. "Right main gear, red light, still red, come on." Sarah felt the asymmetric drag as only one main gear deployed. The aircraft wanted to yaw, wanted to turn, and she had to fight the rudder pedals to keep them straight. "Right main gear, yellow light, still yellow." 20 seconds passed. 30. The gear was stuck, partially deployed but not locked. If they landed like this, with one gear fully down and one gear only partially extended, the aircraft would collapse on the weak side. They'd cartwheel down the runway at 150 miles per hour. "Right main gear," Rodriguez said, his voice barely audible over the alarms. "Green light, down and locked." Another massive clunk. "Nose gear," Rodriguez continued. "Deploying, green light, all 3 down and locked." Sarah exhaled. Small victory, but they'd lost critical airspeed during the gear deployment. They were now at 170 knots, barely above stall speed with their current configuration. "Altitude 4,000 feet, she said. 3 miles to runway." The EGT gauge hit 1,050 degrees. Smoke began trailing from the right engine. "Engine failure imminent," Rodriguez warned. "EGT critical." "Just a little longer," Sarah whispered. "Just hold together a little longer." The airport was massive in their windscreen now. She could see people standing on the terminal roof, watching. She could see the runway numbers, 26R, painted in huge white letters on the concrete. Altitude 3,000 feet, 2 miles. The engine was screaming now, a high-pitched whine of tortured metal. 1 mile to runway threshold, Rodriguez called out. Altitude 2,000 feet. Sarah's world narrowed to a pinpoint of focus. The runway, the airspeed, the altitude, nothing else existed. The engine exploded. The explosion wasn't loud. It was a deep, bass-heavy whump that Sarah felt in her bones more than heard. The right engine disintegrated in a spectacular failure of metal and fire. Turbine blades sheared off and shot in every direction like shrapnel from a bomb. One massive piece punched through the wing's trailing edge, leaving a jagged hole the size of a dinner table. Another piece ricocheted off the fuselage with a metallic scream that echoed through the entire aircraft. And then silence. Not complete silence, but the absence of the sound that had been their lifeline for the last desperate minutes. The steady roar of the engine was gone, replaced only by the whistle of wind through the damaged windshield and the electronic beeping of a dozen alarm systems that no longer mattered. They were a glider now, a 132,000-pound aluminum tube with no power, falling toward Earth at the mercy of physics and prayer. "Engine failure," Rodriguez shouted unnecessarily, his voice cracking. "Complete loss of thrust. We've lost both engines." Sarah's hands moved across the controls with desperate precision. The yoke felt different now, heavier, more dead. Without engine thrust, without the subtle push that kept them aloft, the aircraft was simply falling. Falling with style, maybe, but falling nonetheless. "Altitude 1,000 feet, Sarah called out, her voice somehow still steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "Airspeed 165 knots. Descent rate 800 feet per minute." She pulled back on the yoke, trying to flatten their descent, trying to stretch their glide just a little bit farther. But every bit of altitude she traded for distance brought them closer to stalling, to that fatal moment when the wings could no longer generate lift, and they'd drop from the sky like a stone. Through the windshield, the runway threshold rushed toward them. 1/2 mile. That's all that separated them from potential safety. 1/2 mile that might as well have been half the world. "We're not going to make it," Rodriguez said, his voice hollow. "We're going to hit short. We're going to." "Shut up," Sarah snapped, her eyes never leaving the runway. "Just shut up and let me fly." Her mind was moving at light speed, calculating angles and distances and probabilities. They were at 900 feet altitude. The runway threshold was at 4,692 feet elevation. She'd memorized that from the approach chart. That meant they had roughly 1,200 feet of actual clearance above the ground. At their current descent rate and airspeed, they would travel. She did the math. Approximately 4,000 feet horizontally. The threshold was 2,400 feet away. They would come up 1,600 feet short. In front of the runway, between them and salvation, was an industrial area. Warehouses, parking lots, a busy 4-lane highway. If they crashed there, they'd take out dozens of innocent people on the ground along with everyone on the plane. Sarah couldn't allow that. "United 447, Pueblo Tower," the radio crackled with barely controlled panic. "You are below glide slope. You are critically low. Advise your status." Rodriguez reached for the radio, but his hand was shaking too badly. Sarah grabbed the microphone with her left hand while her right remained locked on the yoke. "Pueblo Tower 447, she said, her voice cutting through the frequency like a blade. "We've lost all engines. We are a glider. We will land on your runway or we will die trying. Clear the airport, clear everything. We're coming in." She released the mic without waiting for a response. Altitude 700 feet, she announced. Airspeed 160 knots. They were over the highway now. Sarah could see cars pulling over, people pointing up at them, some diving out of their vehicles and running. Smart people. If this went wrong in the next 15 seconds, that highway would become a scene of unimaginable carnage. 600 feet, Rodriguez called out, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah, we're not going to. Yes, we are, Sarah roared. She did something then that went against every instinct, every bit of training, every regulation in the book. She pushed the yoke forward, pointing the nose down, increasing their descent rate, increasing the very thing that was trying to kill them. What are you doing? Rodriguez screamed. You're diving, But Sarah knew exactly what she was doing. By diving, she was trading altitude for airspeed. The aircraft accelerated 170 knots, 175, 180. And with that extra speed came extra lift, extra energy, extra momentum. She was falling faster, yes, but she was also covering ground faster. It was a gamble measured in seconds and feet, in the razor-thin margin between genius and suicide. The industrial buildings flashed past below them, so close that Sarah could see people on the roofs, could see the terror on their faces. A water tower loomed directly in their path. She banked slightly left, felt the wing tip miss it by what couldn't have been more than 50 feet. Threshold, Rodriguez shouted. We're over the threshold. They'd made it, barely, impossibly. They were over the runway. But they were still falling at 1,200 feet per minute, still traveling at 180 knots, still 50 feet too high to land. Sarah hauled back on the yoke with every ounce of strength she possessed. The nose came up, up. She felt the aircraft shudder on the edge of a stall, felt the wings begging her not to push any harder. The stall warning horn blared, a piercing sound that meant they were seconds from dropping out of the sky. Altitude 20 feet, Rodriguez screamed. 15, 10. The runway concrete was right there, close enough to touch, close enough to see individual cracks and patches in the pavement. Flare, flare, Rodriguez yelled. Sarah pulled harder, feeling something pop in her shoulder as she physically wrenched the yoke back. The aircraft's nose lifted, the tail dropped, and for one perfect moment they were in the landing attitude, the exact position they needed to be. Then gravity reasserted itself. The main landing gear struck the runway with a force that Sarah felt in every bone of her body. It wasn't a landing, it was a controlled crash. The tires exploded on contact, all 4 main gear tires shredding instantly under the impact force and the weight of the aircraft. Metal wheels hit concrete with a shower of sparks. "Brakes," Sarah shouted, standing on the brake pedals with her full body weight. But there was almost nothing there. The hydraulics were gone. The brakes were operating on residual pressure alone. She felt them engage, felt the tiniest bit of deceleration, but it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. They were traveling at 165 knots, 190 miles per hour, on 4 metal wheels throwing up a rooster tail of sparks that lit up the afternoon like a fireworks display. Through the windshield, Sarah could see the end of the runway approaching with sickening speed. 8,400 feet of runway. They'd used maybe 500 of those feet just touching down. That left 7,900 feet to stop a 132,000-pound aircraft that was barely slowing. "We're not stopping," Rodriguez screamed. "We're not going to stop." Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't. Every ounce of her concentration was focused on 3 things: keeping the aircraft straight, maximizing what little braking they had, and calculating whether they were going to live or die. The sparks from the metal wheels were creating actual flames now, friction heating the wheel rims to thousands of degrees. Smoke poured from the landing gear, thick and black. The smell of burning metal filled the cockpit. 6,000 feet of runway remaining, still traveling at 140 knots. Sarah deployed the speed brakes, panels on the wings that would create drag. They extended partially, fighting against the lack of hydraulics. Every little bit helped. 4,000 feet remaining, 120 knots. She could see the end now, really see it. The concrete gave way to grass, and beyond that, a perimeter fence, and beyond that, an open field that dropped off into a ravine. 2,000 feet remaining, 100 knots. Brace for impact, Jennifer's voice screamed through the cabin. Brace, brace, brace. 1,000 feet remaining, 80 knots. Sarah's world had become a tunnel, the runway end, only the runway end, closer, closer, still too fast. 500 feet remaining, 65 knots. She was going to run out of runway. They were going to run off the end at highway speed, and the aircraft was going to break apart, and people were going to die, and she had failed. She had failed. 300 feet remaining, 50 knots. 200 feet, 40 knots. 100 feet, 30 knots. The aircraft slowed, and stopped. With 73 feet of runway remaining, United Flight 447 finally came to rest, smoke pouring from its destroyed landing gear, its fuselage covered in scorch marks and debris, its windshield shattered, both engines gone. But stopped. On the runway. Still in one piece. For 3 seconds nobody moved, nobody breathed, nobody dared believe it was over. Then slowly, Sarah's hands released the yoke. They were shaking so badly she had to clutch them together to make them stop. "We're down," she whispered. We're down." For exactly 5 seconds, the cockpit of United Flight 447 was perfectly silent. Sarah sat frozen in her seat, her hands still gripping the yoke even though the aircraft was no longer moving, her eyes staring straight ahead at the runway that had almost been their grave. Beside her, Captain Rodriguez slumped against his restraints, his face gray with shock and pain, his broken arm cradled against his chest. Then the fire alarms began screaming. "Fire, fire," Rodriguez gasped, his eyes going wide. "Right wing, the fuel tanks." Sarah's combat training overrode her shock instantly. She whipped her head to the right and saw it through the side window, orange flames licking up from the destroyed engine housing, spreading along the wing surface toward the fuel tank that held thousands of pounds of highly explosive jet fuel. "Evacuate," Sarah roared into the intercom, her voice cutting through every speaker in the aircraft. "Evacuate now, all exits, go, go, go." Behind them in the cabin, Jennifer Martinez was already in motion. The moment the aircraft had stopped, she'd launched into the emergency evacuation procedures she'd trained for hundreds of times but prayed she'd never have to use. "Release SEATBLTS, leave everything," Jennifer screamed, her voice hoarse. "Get to the EXITS, move, move, move." The emergency slides deployed with explosive pops, massive yellow chutes that inflated in seconds, providing escape routes from the doomed aircraft. Sarah could hear them through the cockpit door, the whoosh of compressed air, the shouts of flight attendants, the screams of passengers who just survived one nightmare and were now facing another. "You need to go," Rodriguez said to Sarah, his voice weak but urgent. "Get out of here. I'll be right behind you." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him. His face was chalk white. His right arm hung uselessly. Blood had soaked through his uniform sleeve and was dripping onto the cockpit floor. He was in shock, probably going into cardiac arrest, and he wanted her to leave him. "Not happening, Captain," Sarah said flatly. She unbuckled her harness with one hand while reaching for Rodriguez's with the other. Through the cockpit windows, she could see emergency vehicles racing toward them, foam trucks already spraying retardant on the burning wing. But the fire was spreading fast, too fast. They had maybe 2 minutes before it reached the fuel tanks, and then this aircraft would become a bomb. "First Officer Kim," Sarah said, looking back at the jump seat where David Kim still sat unconscious, secured by Jennifer before the landing. "Can you move?" Rodriguez tried to stand and immediately collapsed back into his seat with a cry of agony. "I can't. My arm, everything spinning. Then I'm carrying you, Sarah said. She was 56 and weighed 140 pounds. Rodriguez was at least 61 and probably 200 pounds. The mathematics of the situation didn't favor success. She didn't care. Sarah grabbed Rodriguez under his good arm and hauled him up, draping him across her shoulders in a fireman's carry that made her entire back scream in protest. Her shoulder, the one she'd injured pulling back on the yoke, sent lightning bolts of agony through her entire right side. She took 2 steps toward the cockpit door and nearly fell. "Leave me," Rodriguez gasped. "Sarah, please save yourself." "I didn't land this plane just to let you die in it," Sarah snarled. "Now shut up and let me work." She staggered forward, Rodriguez's weight threatening to crush her. Behind her, still secured in the jump seat, First Officer Kim groaned, the first sign of consciousness he'd shown since being injured. Sarah made a split-second decision. She couldn't carry both of them, but she could get help. The cockpit door burst open and Jennifer appeared, her face streaked with soot and tears. "Everyone's evacuating. We need to," she stopped, seeing Sarah struggling with Rodriguez. "Oh my God." "Help me with the captain," Sarah commanded. "Then we get Kim." Jennifer didn't hesitate. She ducked under Rodriguez's other side, taking some of his weight. Together, the 2 women half carried, half dragged him toward the cabin. The scene inside the aircraft was chaos. Passengers were streaming toward the 4 exits, 2 forward, 2 aft, where emergency slides waited. Some people moved quickly and efficiently. Others froze in panic, blocking the aisles. A few tried to grab their carry-on luggage until flight attendants physically stopped them. "Leave it," another flight attendant screamed at a businessman clutching his laptop bag. "Your life is worth more than your computer." Smoke was beginning to fill the cabin now, acrid and thick, pouring in from the burning wing. Sarah's eyes watered as she and Jennifer dragged Rodriguez toward the forward left exit where the flow of evacuating passengers was moving fastest. "How many left?" Sarah gasped. "Maybe 30, Jennifer replied. "The rear exits are taking longer. There's an elderly woman in a wheelchair and—" An explosion rocked the aircraft. Not the catastrophic fuel tank explosion that would kill them all, but something smaller, probably a hydraulic line rupturing from the heat. The plane shuddered and fresh flames erupted from the right wing, spreading faster now. They reached the exit. The slide was right there, a steep yellow ramp to safety. Sarah and Jennifer pushed Rodriguez to the opening where another flight attendant waited. "I've got him," the attendant said, grabbing Rodriguez. "Go, jump." Rodriguez went down the slide in a tumbling heap, landing at the bottom where firefighters immediately grabbed him and dragged him away from the burning aircraft. Passengers were scattered across the tarmac like dropped toys, some running, some lying on the ground in shock, some being tended to by paramedics. "Your turn," Jennifer shouted at Sarah. "Get out." "First Officer Kim is still in the cockpit," Sarah shouted back. "And I need a count. How many passengers are still on board?" "I don't know, maybe 20, but Sarah, the fire." Another explosion, bigger this time. The right wing was fully engulfed now, flames reaching 30 feet into the air. The heat was becoming unbearable even inside the cabin. Sarah made her decision. She turned and ran toward the cockpit, against the flow of evacuating passengers, back into the smoke and heat and imminent death. "Sarah, no," Jennifer screamed behind her. But Sarah was already gone, pushing past terrified passengers, her lungs burning from smoke inhalation, her eyes streaming tears. She burst into the cockpit where First Officer Kim was struggling weakly against his restraints, semi-conscious and confused. "Come on," Sarah said, unbuckling him. "We're leaving now." Kim was smaller than Rodriguez, but he was deadweight, barely able to help. Sarah got him upright, slung his arm over her shoulders and began dragging him out. Every step was agony. Her legs felt like jelly. Her lungs screamed for clean air. The smoke was so thick now she could barely see 5 feet ahead. In the cabin, the last passengers were evacuating. Sarah saw an elderly couple. They had to be in their 80s, struggling toward an exit. She saw a mother carrying a toddler, the child's face buried in her shoulder. She saw Jennifer helping a teenage girl who'd twisted her ankle during landing. And she saw the fire. It had reached the cabin now, flames licking through the floor near the rear galley. The carpet was burning. The overhead bins were starting to melt. They had seconds, maybe 30 seconds, before the aircraft became an inferno. "Everybody out," Sarah roared with the last of her breath. "Out now." She reached the forward exit and shoved Kim toward it. He tumbled down the slide semi-conscious, landing in a heap at the bottom where hands immediately grabbed him. "That's everyone," Jennifer shouted, appearing beside Sarah. "We're the last ones, jump." Through the exit, Sarah could see the tarmac. Safety, survival, fresh air. She could see Rodriguez being loaded onto a stretcher. She could see Kim being tended to by paramedics. She could see 156 passengers scattered across the pavement, alive, breathing, saved. The aircraft groaned around them, the sound of metal structure failing under extreme heat. "You first," Sarah said to Jennifer. "Are you kidding me? Ladies first, now." "Flight attendant first," Sarah said. "That's an order." Jennifer stared at her for one moment, then nodded. She sat down at the edge of the exit and pushed off, sliding down to safety. Sarah was alone. She stood at the threshold, looking back at the burning cabin one last time. This aircraft had almost been their tomb. Instead, through a combination of training, luck, and sheer stubborn refusal to accept death, it had become their salvation. The main fuel tank exploded. The blast wave hit Sarah like a physical fist, throwing her forward and out of the aircraft. She flew through the air, missing the slide entirely, and hit the tarmac hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs. She lay there, stunned, as a massive fireball erupted from the aircraft behind her, turning United Flight 447 into a blazing funeral pyre. Strong hands grabbed her under the arms and dragged her away from the flames. Firefighters, EMTs, people shouting her name, asking if she was okay, telling her to stay still. Sarah rolled onto her back and stared up at the sky. It was blue, perfectly, impossibly blue. They were alive. All of them. 162 souls. All alive. Sarah Chen, Major in the United States Marine Corps, veteran of 87 combat missions, began to cry. Sarah sat on the tarmac, wrapped in a silver emergency blanket that did nothing to stop her shaking. Around her, Pueblo Memorial Airport had transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. Ambulances lined up like soldiers at attention, their lights painting the afternoon in alternating red and blue. Paramedics moved between survivors, checking vitals, treating injuries, offering water and comfort. And behind it all, United Flight 447 burned like a bonfire, black smoke billowing thousands of feet into the Colorado sky. A paramedic, young, maybe 25, with kind eyes, crouched in front of Sarah. "Ma'am, I need to check you for injuries. Can you tell me your name?" "Sarah," she whispered, her voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. "Major Sarah Chen." The paramedic's eyes widened with recognition. Word had already spread. The pilot from Seat 8A, the Marine who'd saved everyone. "Major Chen," he said carefully, "you're in shock. That's completely normal. I need you to let me examine you, okay?" Sarah nodded numbly. She let him check her pulse, shine a light in her eyes, listen to her lungs. Her right shoulder was badly strained, possibly torn ligaments. Her hands were covered in small cuts from gripping the controls. Her lungs burned from smoke, but she was alive. 20 feet away, Captain Rodriguez lay on a stretcher, an IV in his good arm, his shattered limb being stabilized by 2 orthopedic specialists who'd been rushed from the hospital. He turned his head, found Sarah's eyes, and mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." Sarah tried to smile, but her face wouldn't cooperate. The adrenaline that had kept her functioning was draining away, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion that went deeper than bone. Major Chen, a new voice. Sarah looked up to see a man in an expensive suit, his tie loosened, sweat on his brow despite the cool afternoon air. I'm James Morrison, Vice President of Flight Operations for United Airlines. I don't even know what to say. What you did up there. His voice cracked. You saved 162 lives. I just flew the plane, Sarah said softly. You did more than that, Morrison replied. You performed a miracle. Behind him, more people were gathering. Airport officials, FAA investigators, the Pueblo fire chief, a woman with a microphone and a camera crew. The media had arrived. Major Chen, the reporter called out, pushing forward. Channel 7 News, can you tell us what happened up there? How did you land the plane? Sarah shook her head. I can't, I need to. She needs medical attention and rest, the paramedic said firmly, stepping between Sarah and the gathering crowd. No interviews right now. But it was too late. More reporters were arriving, drawn by the pillar of smoke and the story of a lifetime. Sarah could see the satellite trucks pulling into the airport, could see photographers with long lenses, could see the machinery of modern media descending on this quiet Colorado airport like locusts on a field. Major Chen, another reporter shouted, is it true you've never flown a 737 before? Did you think you were going to die? How does it feel to be a hero? Hero? The word felt wrong in Sarah's mouth. Heroes were people who ran into burning buildings or threw themselves on grenades. She'd just done what she was trained to do, what any pilot would have done. Except every other pilot was a passenger today, sitting in the cabin, helpless. She'd been in seat 8A. Everyone please step back, a new voice commanding and firm. A woman in an Air Force uniform pushed through the crowd, a colonel, her chest covered in ribbons and medals. I'm Colonel Patricia Hayes, commanding officer of the 302nd Airlift Wing. Major Chen is one of our nation's finest pilots, and she needs space right now. All media inquiries will go through the United Airlines press office. Colonel Hayes knelt beside Sarah, her stern face softening. Major, I've already contacted your command. They're sending someone to escort you home. Your wife has been notified that you're safe. Jessica, oh God, Jessica. My phone, Sarah said suddenly, patting her pockets with shaking hands. I need to call my wife. I need to. She's on her way, Colonel Hayes said gently. The Marines are flying her and your daughter here on a military transport. They'll be here in 3 hours. 3 hours. Sarah would have to survive 3 more hours before she could hold her family, before she could feel something real and solid and normal. Around the burning aircraft, firefighters had finally gotten the flames under control, though it would burn for hours yet. The skeleton of the 737 stood like a monument to what might have been, a tomb that held no bodies, a disaster that had been transformed into a miracle by skill and luck and desperate courage. Passengers were beginning to gather in small groups, some being treated by paramedics, others just sitting on the tarmac in stunned disbelief. Sarah watched them, really watched them. The elderly couple she'd seen struggling toward the exit were holding hands, tears streaming down their wrinkled faces. The mother with the toddler was rocking her child, singing softly. The businessman from seat 8B was on his phone, sobbing as he spoke to someone, probably telling them he was alive. Then Sarah saw something that made her breath catch. A young girl, maybe 10 years old with dark hair and pigtails, broke away from her parents and ran toward Sarah. Before anyone could stop her, she threw herself at Sarah, wrapping thin arms around her neck. You saved my mommy and daddy, the girl sobbed into Sarah's shoulder. You saved all of us. Thank you so much. Sarah's arms came up automatically, holding the child, and something inside her finally broke. The tears came then, great racking sobs that shook her entire body. She held this stranger's daughter and cried for the terror they'd all endured, for the impossible choices she'd had to make, for the weight of 162 souls that she'd carried on her shoulders and somehow, impossibly, had not dropped. "It's okay," the girl whispered, patting Sarah's back like Sarah was the child who needed comforting. "It's okay now. We're safe." The girl's parents came to collect her, and they too were crying, thanking Sarah with words that felt inadequate for what she'd done. And then more passengers came. One by one, then in groups, they approached Sarah where she sat on the tarmac wrapped in her emergency blanket. An elderly man pressed a St. Christopher medal into her hand. "My father gave this to me in World War II. It kept me safe through 40 combat missions. Now it's yours." A businesswoman handed Sarah a card. "My company, anything you ever need, it's yours. Legal services, financial planning, whatever, for life, free." A college student showed Sarah his phone, where he'd been texting his mother goodbye when they thought they were going to crash. "I get to tell her I'm okay now because of you." The stories poured out, the gratitude, the tears, the overwhelming reality of what had almost happened and what had actually happened. Sarah listened to each one, accepted each thank you, held each person who needed to be held. And slowly, sitting there on the tarmac of Pueblo Memorial Airport, Sarah began to understand what she'd really done. She hadn't just landed a plane. She preserved 162 futures, 162 sets of hopes and dreams, 162 people who would go home tonight, who would hug their families, who would live their lives, get married, have children, grow old, experience joy and heartbreak and all the messy, beautiful chaos of human existence. Because she'd been in seat 8A. By the time the sun began to set, painting the Colorado sky in shades of orange and gold, the story had gone viral. Sarah's name was trending on every social media platform. News networks were leading with it. Marine pilot performs miracle landing. Hero in seat 8A saves 162 lives. Combat veteran lands crippled airliner with no training. Her phone, recovered from the wreckage, had 847 missed calls and thousands of texts. Messages from high school friends she hadn't spoken to in 20 years. From fellow pilots expressing their awe. From military brass. From the governor of Colorado. From people she'd never met thanking her for showing them what courage looked like. But Sarah only cared about one message. "Mom's coming home, Emma. I told you she would. I love you both so much. See you soon. Jessica." When the military transport landed and Jessica and Emma ran across the tarmac toward her, Sarah forgot about her injuries, forgot about the cameras, forgot about everything except her family. She caught them both in her arms, holding them so tight it hurt, breathing in the smell of Jessica's perfume and Emma's strawberry shampoo. "I made you a banner," Emma said through tears. "It says, 'Welcome home, hero.'" "I'm not a hero, baby," Sarah whispered. "I'm just your mom." "No," Jessica said firmly, pulling back to look Sarah in the eyes. "You're both, and I'm so proud of you I can't even breathe." 3 days later, United Airlines CEO personally presented Sarah with an unlimited lifetime flying pass. The president called to thank her. The Marine Corps awarded her the Distinguished Flying Cross. Pueblo, Colorado declared Sarah Chen Day and erected a memorial at the airport. But the moment that mattered most came 2 weeks after the crash, at a memorial service held for United Flight 447, not for the dead, because there were none, but for the living. All 162 passengers gathered along with the crew to celebrate the gift of continued life. Sarah stood at the podium looking out at the faces she'd saved, the elderly couple, the mother and toddler, the businessman, the college student, the girl with pigtails, Captain Rodriguez, his arm in a cast, First Officer Kim, stitches still visible on his face, Jennifer and the other flight attendants. "I'm not good at speeches," Sarah began, her voice quiet. "I'm a pilot. I'm more comfortable in a cockpit than on a stage, but I need you all to know something." She paused, gathering her thoughts. That day in that aircraft, I wasn't thinking about being a hero. I was thinking about my wife and daughter. I was thinking about getting home. And then I realized you all had people waiting for you too. You all had homes to get to, lives to live. And I'll be honest, I was terrified. I didn't know if I could do it. I wasn't sure we'd make it. Her voice cracked slightly. But we did make it together, because Captain Rodriguez stayed conscious through agony to help me, because First Officer Kim survived to inspire me to keep fighting, because Jennifer and the crew kept everyone calm, because you passengers trusted me, a stranger with your lives. We survived together. She smiled through tears. So when people call me a hero, I want to correct them. We're all heroes. Every single person who walked away from that aircraft is a hero for surviving, for helping each other, for choosing to live. That's what I'll remember. Not the fear, not the fire, but the grace and courage of 162 people facing death and refusing to accept it. The applause started slowly, then built to a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes. Sarah Chen, Major USMC, the hero of Seat 8A, stood among the people she'd saved, and finally, she felt at peace. She'd been exactly where she needed to be. In Seat 8A. The end.